This is the secret world of Whitehall. Decisions taken here behind closed doors affect all our daily lives. I'm telling the inside story of what's gone on over the years in the great institutions at the very heart of government. Tonight, how the hidden network of private offices operates. Every government minister has a private office run by a small team of high-flying civil servants. Their job is to manage the minister's professional life and to protect, guide and inform.
He told me, we have one allegiance, you. So we fight your battles for you, we guard your back.
What many people don't realise is just how intimate the relationship between a private office and their minister is.
That intense loyalty to whoever is there, has to be seen to be believed.
But also working with the private office are shadowy figures, sometimes dubbed the people who live in the dark. They're the special advisors, and unlike the neutral civil servants, they're party political, and there have been many bloody power struggles waged within this most influential of Whitehall's secret networks. A job in the private office can be the route to the top of the civil service or politics if you're young and ambitious. 20 years ago, the Chancellor Norman Lamont's special advisor was one David Cameron, who was with him on Black Wednesday.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day.
Lamont had to resign as Chancellor after Black Wednesday, but David Cameron moved on to another top private office as special advisor to the Home Secretary Michael Howard. There his task was to advise Howard on political pitfalls and image presentation. Also doing the same thing as a special advisor in another ministry and then in number 10 was the young George Osborne. He would sometimes work hand in glove with David Cameron.
And do you think we've got a killer blow that...
Well, we certainly hope so. We're going to go and see.
When New Labour came to power, there were many more special advisors, known in Whitehall as SPADs. Ed Balls was Chief SPAD to the new Chancellor, Gordon Brown. Another SPAD, learning his trade in the Chancellor's private office, was the youthfully bespectacled Ed Miliband.
A new class of person has emerged. They're usually young graduates, often with no experience outside politics, who've come straight from university, intellectually clever, enthusiastic, but I think that, I don't think it's added to politics.
30 years ago, a TV satire showed how the top civil servant in the private office reacted to the intrusion of a political advisor.
Bernard Woolley, Principal Private Secretary. This is Mr. Lloyd Pritchard, Assistant Prime Minister. This is my political advisor. Oh, yes, of course. Mr. Wise.
Yes, Minister was depicting with complete historical accuracy how the real private office civil servants sought to marginalise the SPADs.
Where are we all going to? Well, you're going to your office, Minister. What about Frank? What's Frank? Oh, he's been taken care of, Minister.
But this is the waiting room.
Precisely, sir.
But I'm Jim Hacker's special advisor.
The Minister now has a whole department to advise him, sir.
Look, he needs me.
Yeah, of course he does, sir, but until the Minister sends for you, would you be so good as to wait?
Although special advisors are now an accepted part of the Whitehall scene, it's the civil servants who've always been and remain the beating heart of the private office network. When Alan Johnson became Home Secretary 2 years ago, he was taken to be introduced to the young civil servants who made up his private office.
Go on, Richard. Okay. Do the honours.
This is Natasha, the security counter-terrorist.
How are you? Charlotte. Hello.
How are you? Louisa, Brandon, Ben,
Just take it into
Gareth, how are you? It's a test for you as well. And Jenny.
Hi Jenny,
how are you? Good to see you.
I think it was summed up by my very first private secretary. I said to him, I don't know where to start. What do you do? So he said, well, I run your private office, and the purpose of your private office is to be your corridor into the rest of government. You've got to understand there's lots of civil servants who will come in to see you, whose allegiance will be elsewhere, to their permanent secretary, to the department, to number 10, He said, we have one allegiance, you. So we fight your battles for you, we guard your back, we convey what you want to the rest of the department and indeed to the rest of Whitehall. It was kind of, 5 minutes, but it summed it up.
What sort of civil servants get chosen to work in the private office?
Well, bright people, high flyers, people who are interested in politics and ministers, and the private office becomes the golden ladder, as it were, to the top. And if you look at some of the people who have become permanent secretaries and indeed cabinet secretaries, many of them have been private secretaries and principal private secretaries on the way up that ladder.
Robin Butler was to become top mandarin after working long hours for 3 prime ministers in the number 10 private office.
I first went into number 10 in 1972, and when I left, I found that I'd never seen my children in their school clothes, because I left before they were dressed in the morning, and I never got home before they were asleep in bed in the evening.
Going up.
In the ministries across Whitehall, the private office normally has pride of place high up in the building.
Doors opening.
There's a team of people out there sitting at desks who are my private office. They're the people who work to you personally, and they really plug me into the rest of the system, and they handle absolutely all the day-to-day activity. They also arrange my diary, moment by moment, day by day, and it goes beyond that, because they get to know what you really want to do, what your priorities are, get to know what the problems are out there, and help you do the job, which is your job, as smoothly as they possibly can.
Private office is absolutely vital to a minister. I mean, they are the eyes and ears within the department, the two-way conduit, the gatekeeper to that minister. They are the first source of immediate policy advice or communication advice before they then get the right officials in to advise.
The other great thing about the private office is it's the shock absorber of the system. Rather than a Secretary of State for X going round to biff Secretary of State for Y because of some slight in the cabinet room or some minute that's come through which is really designed to irritate or subvert, the private office network has a chat amongst itself to try and soothe things.
The private office goes back to the very first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, in the 18th century. His private secretary was the son of the Earl of Dartmouth. Over the following 2 centuries, as ministries became more powerful and government more involved in raising and spending public money, the private office network developed across Whitehall. It was given a huge boost by Lloyd George when he became Prime Minister in the middle of the First World War. He decided on a total reorganisation of central government. A powerful new number 10 private office was to be the command and control centre of Whitehall. And for the first time, a record would be made of cabinet decisions. The national shorthand champion became Lloyd George's first private secretary.
I was ushered into the cabinet room, and there I sat with the cabinet ministers around me, and I took shorthand notes. It was the first time that any shorthand writer had ever been in that cabinet room to take a cabinet discussion. And then I typed it out on my typewriter.
Starting with Sylvester's typewriter, Lloyd George made number 10 the prototype for a private office in every Whitehall ministry. He'd recruited so many staff to his own private office that they had to be housed in temporary huts in the number 10 garden that became known as Lloyd George's garden suburb. Over the years, the power of the private offices has grown in every ministry. They provide an unrivaled confidential network for the exchange of inside information and Whitehall gossip. And a job in the private office is the aim for every civil service high flyer in Whitehall that's traditionally been a hierarchical place.
The pecking order in Whitehall is still very important. The head of the department gets a big desk, a big chair, a thick carpet, and a very high-class secretary. Note also that he has an individual coat stand and an old master on the wall. His number 2, however, gets a rather more functional map, a smaller table, and, as you will note behind his head, a mere peg on the wall for his coat. But he has at least an individual, if rather austere light, not just a supermarket strip light, like these two poor chaps who even have to share a room. But I bet they both took double firsts and will both end up as ambassadors.
Every ambitious young civil servant feels the pull of the private office.
Private office. I think this is probably one of the most interesting aspects of a civil servant's career.
Yes, I'm sure.
It means really acting as the link between the minister on the one hand and literally everybody else on the other. Members of Parliament, other ministers, members of the public, local authorities, pressure groups, the lot.
A sort of protector of the minister.
Yes, not always an appreciated protector, but nevertheless a protector. It meant, of course, a constant runaround, but I was allowed half a day off to go and get married. And strictly on the work side, if you enjoy politics and seeing how they work and how the whole machine of government works, as I do, then I think you would find it fascinating.
What they acquire is experience, because they're all been identified really as young, high-flying civil servants expected to go a long way in their civil service careers, and they're having a tremendous close-up view of how government works.
Wherever ministers go, they like to be in constant touch with their private office. Eric Varley, a Labour cabinet minister in the mid-70s, would communicate using state-of-the-art technology.
Alison, I wonder if all the briefing is complete for Cabinet this morning. I wonder if I could have a meeting with officials before that. Over?
There's a possibility there might be a PNQ, which we'll keep in touch with Parliamentary branch about. But I think also the Prime Minister has questions this afternoon and he may get asked about it.
The private office includes the Diary Secretary, a number of policy specialists, and it's headed by the Principal Private Secretary, who's the main point of contact for the Minister.
Yes, well, I'm probably closer to him than any other civil servant in the department. I see everything he does. I attend all his meetings. I try to see things through his eyes.
I rather think that the role of the private office, so far as the civil service is concerned, is to wrap the Secretary of State or the Minister in cotton wool, keep the tabs on him, to make sure that he's certainly informed, but also to perhaps insulate him from a degree of reality from the outside world.
But the private office's precise method of insulation can vary according to the minister's status, as one ambitious politician discovered in 1970.
I arrived in this room, a very large room, completely empty of all paperwork, and I assumed someone would tell me sooner or later what I was supposed to do. No one did. And I sat there. They brought the coffee, and it was not for half an hour or so, and I'd read the papers. There were a lot of papers. I remember that. Every national newspaper was available in my office for me to read. It was only about an hour and a half later that I really came to grips with the problem that I had to be a self-starter. I had to make it clear what I wanted to do and the way I saw my job evolving. There was no induction course, no training, no guidelines. In many ways, that's one of the most critical moments of a minister's career, whether he ever survives that moment when, if he doesn't emerge and take a command of the situation, he will simply become the victim of the mountain of paperwork which will flow across his desk.
Basically, you were a bag carrier. You were expected to attend meetings with your Secretary of State and listen and perhaps be asked for your opinion, but you had no real power or responsibility. You had a private office which reflected that. I mean, your private secretary was being trained as a civil servant in the experience of ministerial life.
Nearly 40 years on, Gordon Brown made the businessman Digby Jones a minister. The Whitehall outsider was surprised by his private office.
I very quickly put a piece of paper on my desk and I wrote on it as best I could to put a word round the sound. So there were lots of sort of O's and C's and S's and H's and exclamation marks. And I can remember my private secretary came in and said, "What's that, Minister?" And I said, "That's the most common sound I hear in this office." And it's usually followed by the words, "Very brave, Minister," or "I wouldn't do that, Minister." And it's this, because they are brought up to be risk averse. Their job in the private office is to serve their nation through the minister, to keep the minister out of trouble, and to keep the minister delivering on agreed policy. That's their job.
But another key job of the private office is to scan the horizon and spot unexpected troubles, especially when a minister is sent to a newly created department.
My principal private secretary rang me up and said, "You'll be getting your first day briefing and all of that." He said, "Did the Prime Minister mention to you about changing the name of the department?" I said, "Yeah, he did say something about productivity, science." He said, "Can I just go through with you what the department's due to be called? It's due to be called the Department of Productivity, Energy, which is usually described as EN, Industry and Science." He said, "You will be the Secretary of State for penis." I said, "Oh, gosh, that doesn't sound very good." So I said, "Well, what can we do about this?" They'd unscrewed Department of Trade and Industry sign from outside Victoria Street. Fortunately, they hadn't put the new name up there. So I kind of stopped any further work on it before I went to see the Prime Minister. And I said, "Do you mind if I raise something with you, Prime Minister?" I said, "The name of the department?" He said, "What's the problem?" So I explained it to him. I said, "It's the Department for Penis. I'd be the Secretary of State for penis." He said, "Well, let's change it back." And all these people sitting around, he said, "Whose idea was this? Talk about success has many parents and failure is an orphan." And no one said anything. He said, "Well, let's just change it back to the Department for Trade and Industry." So I came out of that meeting with my first great victory. But really, because I was alerted to it very early on by my principal private secretary.
When David Blunkett became Education Secretary in '97, he was the first blind cabinet minister. And his principal private secretary, Alan Evans, had worked out in advance how to make Blunkett's ministerial life easier.
We did have a bit of a glitch because I'd ordered via my officials a state-of-the-art Braille machine which converted Word documents into Braille, and David Blunkett didn't often use Braille, but he did for formal set pieces like statements to Parliament or briefings with the Prime Minister. And the first briefing to the Prime Minister we duly produced in Braille in the first week, and we handed it to him with about 5 minutes to go before the meeting, as often happens last minute, and he grabbed it and went into number 10. What we hadn't realised was that the Braille machine was made in Sweden and had a switch on the back of the machine which switched from English to Swedish Braille, and we had handed him a perfect, word-perfect copy of Swedish Braille briefing on education policy. He winged it and did it very well.
Must have been something of a surprise for him as he was trying to read it.
Well, it was. He sort of found a bit of sort of hurdy-gurdy smorgasbord, I think, on the text in front of him.
Peter Mandelson had a succession of private offices across Whitehall, before ending up as First Secretary of State at the Department of Business Innovation and Skills.
The private office and the private secretaries play an absolutely crucial, seminal, professional, really brilliant role, and it's a sort of, it's a joy to work with them, and to see that sort of dedication and working round the clock and that intense loyalty to whoever is there, has to be seen to be believed.
In his private office, Mandelson goes through his diary.
Marie, I'm going to Nottingham tomorrow, yeah?
Yeah. There's a reception tomorrow night and then...
How annoying.
Is there anything you wanted to do on Friday specifically?
I want it to be my time, my thinking time, my work.
The key coupling in the private office was described by Benjamin Disraeli, the Victorian Chancellor and Prime Minister, a century and a half ago. He said relations between the Minister and his private secretary are, or should be, among the finest that can subsist between two individuals, except for the married state.
What many people don't realise is just how intimate the relationship between a private office and their minister is.
You do form a very close relationship with your private secretary.
The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd and his principal private secretary John Sawers would go for early morning swims at international conferences. Sawers is now head of MI6.
I used to get my private secretary into a sort of discipline, getting up early in the morning and swim, and sometimes it was extremely cold, but it just sharpens up your body and your mind.
The private office. It's very beguiling. It is a very hothouse environment. You live on very close terms with your minister, your Secretary of State, and that is the most important person in your life. And some civil servants, when they enter into a private office, can become too close to the minister.
A sensational example of a private office relationship too close happened in the 60s. John Vassall was private secretary to the Navy minister. He was revealed as a KGB spy who'd been entrapped by the Soviet communists in a homosexual sting. His minister at the Admiralty was Tam Galbraith, an aristocratic Tory. The revelation that the minister had sent his private secretary letters beginning, "My dear Vassall," caused a scandal. Amid lurid rumours, Galbraith resigned, saying, "My long-accustomed manner of dealing with officials has become an embarrassment." Vassall was jailed for 10 years for spying for the Russians, while Galbraith was exonerated by an official inquiry. Alan Clark was one of Mrs. Thatcher's ministers.
It feels so good. You're lying here next to me.
A renowned womanizer, Clark revealed in his diaries, which were later dramatised, how he lusted after his principal private secretary.
Jenny Easterbrook, sexuality tightly controlled. She makes plain her feelings on several accounts without expressing them.
Take dictation?
No, Minister.
Shorthand?
I'm an official, not a typist. The Enterprise Allowance Scheme, Job Release Scheme, Community Scheme. They will expect you to have at least some knowledge of those, even if you can't fully get to grips with them.
What is wrong with two human beings of the opposite sex feeling attracted to each other? I don't see how that can be scandalous.
For some reason, all the attention seems to be on her.
Sequins, that's what you need.
As Secretary of State for Wales, William Hague fared better than Alan Clark. He and Fionn Jenkins, his private office secretary, fell in love and they got married.
This time it looks like love is here to stay.
The one thing the private office does, and I think does brilliantly actually, is it's loyal. You do know that they will come in and they'll close the door and they'll tell you where they think this wasn't your finest moment, or indeed, let's equip you for what is hopefully a finer moment tomorrow. But they are on your side, and they see their job as serving their country through this minister.
The private office is a vital part of the ability of a minister to run his or her department and to carry out policy. Essential to it is a relationship of trust. And what I think is so remarkable is that in all the years I've been in politics, I can think of no instance at all of a private secretary breaching that trust by telling stories about his minister or her minister to the newspapers, to television, to the media. If they do it so wonderfully private that nobody ever discovers.
One remarkable episode that was kept completely secret by the number 10 private office happened in the summer of 1953. It involved the Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He suffered a severe stroke and was no longer able to function. Churchill's private office decided that the outside world must be kept in the dark, and it conspired with the powerful press barons. The Tory MP Bill Deeds, who was soon to become a Churchill minister, worked closely with the proprietor of the Daily Telegraph.
There was, I don't use the word, there was an agreement, not a conspiracy, to keep it quiet. And it worked.
Churchill's private office, that was headed by Sir Jock Colville, who'd been with him during the war, reached a deal to keep news of Churchill's condition out of the press. And Colville, along with Christopher Soames, Churchill's son-in-law, ran the country, while the real Prime Minister was kept incommunicado and out of public sight. Colville and Soames were Churchill impersonators.
Christopher Soames knew how to get the signature right. He could sign Winston Churchill.
So you saying after Churchill had his stroke that Christopher Soames was
I don't think many
signing...
went out. Yes, I think there was a bit of that, yes.
You know this? You know
I suppose
this?
I do, yes, yes. But I don't think, really, that the covering up of his stroke was deceitful. I don't think it was as it were, a black mark on government. I think it was quite important to maintain an appearance of normality. Anyway, we managed to do it.
All private offices in the ministries of Whitehall are repositories of secrets held by civil servants about their political masters.
They have to know every bit of the emotional life pretty well of the minister they're serving. If they have mistresses, they have to know about them in case they have to get them all times of night and day. And they have to have no secrets from each other if it's going to work properly.
One of the ways that the private office civil servants discover everything they can happens every time a minister makes a phone call.
Morning, John. You know, it'll be a few days.
The way it worked with the Tory minister Peter Walker in the 70s is the way it's still done in private office today. Everything a minister says is monitored by a private secretary listening on an extension outside.
I remember when I first stepped into my private office, I was horrified to note that when I picked up the phone, another phone was being picked up at the exactly instantaneous moment. And after about 10 minutes of this, I remember barging into the secretary's office, which was next door to mine, and saying, "What the hell do you think you're doing? Why are you listening into my conversations? No, you are not entitled to do that. I don't want to have any more of it." And they then patiently explained to me that every conversation conducted by a minister is listened to by his or her civil servant.
Did that come as a surprise to you?
That someone listens in, it did, and I didn't realise at first. So you're having a conversation, and then Simon would come in, his private secretary, and I'd start explaining, "Oh, look, I just had a phone call from number 10, and they were saying," he'd say, "Yes, I know, I was listening." "Oh," struck me as rather rude, but of course it's really important.
Well, most ministers accept that for everything apart from entirely private conversations, an official will listen in to a conversation, and that's actually quite important and quite useful, because if you're not listening in, no doubt someone will be listening in at the other end, and then you'll have a phone call with the other private office, and they say, "Well, your minister said X." And if you haven't been listening in, how do you know your minister said X rather than Y?
If I'm having a phone call with a senior colleague, another member of the cabinet, Lord knows how many people are listening, probably 4 or 5 by the time you've finished. Probably the person responsible for that area of policy in the department, someone from my private office, in my colleagues, and it's the same. It is a way of just not having to get into the car and go over, but you have a recorded meeting. And that is very important, not least because it stops you arguing a week later about what it was you did agree on, and it also means that somebody automatically actions it.
There's always someone, always at least one person. Sometimes it's a whole team. It's a spectator sport, making a phone call when it's really, really difficult. You know, if it's an issue about the spending review and you're in the last knockings of negotiations with the Treasury, or it's a phone call with the Prime Minister. You'll have lots of people. You'll have everyone listening in at both ends of the phone call.
The number 10 private office is the nerve centre of Whitehall, monitoring all calls and seeking to draw the positives from face-to-face meetings that the PM holds.
When I was Health Secretary, I had the most frightful rows with Margaret Thatcher. I used to go over and have one-to-ones with her in Downing Street, and they were always the most unbelievable, lively rows. Both of us quite liked having good, lively political debate, but she could be pretty forceful. And the private secretary from her office used to keep a minute, used to decide what it was we just agreed on, when you probably wouldn't have got the two of us to agree on what we just agreed on, to move it on a bit. And my private office used to ring him up. Before I got back, he told me later, and he would mark it on the Richter scale for liveliness, because so they know what I would be like when I came in. How lively had this one been?
A prime task for the civil servants in the private office network across Whitehall is to deal with the vast flow of paperwork that comes in, requiring answers every day. The private office has to go through it and decide what they can deal with themselves and what they should send up to the minister, along with their advice and recommendations for action.
The private office have a very, very important sifting role. Half the stuff that the department wants me to see, it's just impossible for one man to see. They have to decide on priority, have to decide on urgency, have to decide what the Secretary of State will either want to see or needs to see, what he needn't see, what can just be farmed off.
A huge amount of information now comes into the private office, far more than ever before. And that puts a great burden and responsibility on the people who do the sifting, because the Foreign Secretary still only has 24 hours in the day. He still does need to sleep. And therefore, the people just outside his office, the sifters who decide what he's going to see, are much more important than they used to be, because the volume of stuff arriving in that outer office is so huge.
You have to concentrate, again, like so many things, on what's urgent and what's important and what doesn't matter so much. I think it's actually probably got harder with the number of emails coming in, because often people now will copy in all ministers as a kind of insurance policy to say you've seen it. So the job of filtering of the private secretary and the private office becomes even more important.
You never know what they've sifted because you only see what comes to you. But I never remember being let down by my private office. So my assumption is that they did an absolutely first-class job. They know what you need to see, and things that are being copied that aren't relevant to you or don't affect you, they perhaps save you the burden of sifting yourself.
If you could complete the first 4 by Saturday evening, your driver could collect them and deliver the other 2.
The famous red box is the focal point of the private office. Every day, private secretaries will pack at least one red box full of important papers for the minister to deal with overnight.
That's in the Casablanca noise levels.
The different private offices, like this one in the Foreign Office, develop their own techniques to encourage ministers to finish their boxes. They pack the papers in a special order, with the simplest at the bottom.
We put in the signature folders first. That's mostly letters to other MPs and to constituents which he's got to sign, because they're supposed to be the easiest. And then things that are sort of for information. So it might be some intelligence, it might be letters from influential people, and then submissions usually recommending action, or notes from us saying we've got a problem on this, what do you want to do about it? So you should open it up, and on the very top would be his diary, bright orange, and then underneath would be a brief for every meeting he has the next day.
One person from one of your private offices told us that to encourage you to do your papers, they would put in a chocolate bar some way into the box so that you would work through it and find the chocolate.
That's not true. I'm not greatly into chocolate bars. No, that's he or she's got the wrong minister, if you've been told that. No, they wouldn't get me with a chocolate bar.
Almost all women are excessively conscientious, characteristic of the gender. Mrs. Thatcher was too, and so she and I would take home 4 red boxes a night and rely on the fact that we were able to sleep for less time than most men require to get through these blasted boxes. So just hour after hour of them.
I had an arrangement with my private secretary. He would signal in the box when I'd reached the stage that I didn't need to go any further. There was a submission on a European standard bus stop, which had come out of some crackpot conference. And what it meant was, everything above that, as I worked through my box, that was fine, that had to be done. Best done tonight if you can. When I reached the European bus stop, I knew firstly that was just a little signal. Below this if you've got time, but below this is not priority.
Some ministers do like taking the box home and working on it by themselves overnight. Other ministers will take a box home, it'll come back in the morning. I remember Ken Clarke We'd do that and sometimes say, afraid I went to Ronnie Scott's last night and the box remains undone in the morning.
And what did you think of that one?
Well, I think it's a rather good idea to go out to 2 or 3 in the morning to listen to jazz at Ronnie Scott's, and on the whole, Ken Clarke would catch up with the box during the day.
Are you staying tonight?
8:30 Ministry of Defence tomorrow. You're there later on, eh? 1 o'clock?
All right, 1 o'clock.
Okay.
I was younger then. I haven't been to Ronnie's for years. I'm far too old now. But I used to go to Ronnie's, and when I first started, yes, I would go to Ronnie's and then get back home 2 or 3 in the morning, then do the box and still go in next day, usually. I can't remember this occasion. I mean, there may be one. I mean, there's no point. If you're dropping asleep over a box, there is no point in doing it, because actually all that's going to happen is you're going to make a frightful mess, whatever you're reading, and you won't remember it, or you'll agree things that you shouldn't.
Inside number 10, the top box of all is packed on the round table in the Principal Private Secretary's office. It's then taken to the Prime Minister.
Up in the study.
One of Margaret Thatcher's private secretaries describes how the private office seeks to help the Prime Minister reach decisions on the contents of the red box.
What we tried to do would be on the top of any pile of papers, however voluminous and complicated, to strip it to its essentials. Sometimes you could do it in one word. Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary says we should go to war with Iran, agree, ? And she can write yes or no. Sometimes you have to build that up into a rather sort of fuller response to a minister. If he's put in a lot of thought to a major paper and it comes out with no written in it, ! You can't just write back a letter saying the Prime Minister has read the Chancellor of the Exchequer's paper and says no. You have to, drawing on your knowledge of the Prime Minister's mind, you have to perhaps enlarge that into a paragraph of carefully considered views which are contrary to those of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, leading to a balanced conclusion. But that's part of the art and craft of the trade of Private Secretary.
Andrew Turnbull was Principal Private Secretary in the number 10 private office for many years and saw how different Prime Ministers dealt with their red boxes.
Mrs. Thatcher was legendary in doing the box. Many's a time when I've 9:30, 10 o'clock, you go up to the flat in the evening, ring the bell, drop the box in, run off and get home, and come back 8:30 the next morning, and it's nearly all been read, and what's more, nearly all been dispatched, in the sense of you've got an answer. John Major was also very diligent. I would say he was as diligent to really put in the work. Didn't have quite a higher score on the decide factor, so you've got a few more please refers, but he was a believer in the daily box. Tony Blair was much more, I'll only deal with the things that are really important and I'll deal with it all at the weekend. And it wasn't, fortunately, in number 10 when Gordon was Prime Minister, but he was also a slow decider.
One number 10 official says that Gordon Brown would never finish his paperwork. And as well as the red boxes, the Prime Minister alone gets another rather special box.
We had a separate box which was of a different colour from the main box for particularly sensitive papers, which only the Prime Minister and the Principal Private Secretary had access to.
And what colour was that box?
It was blue with a red stripe, and it was known as Old Stripey.
And this had the sort of secret intelligence files and the spy stuff?
And highly confidential stuff, not just intelligence, but other highly confidential and personal stuff which the Principal Private Secretary was dealing with directly with the Prime Minister.
And was Old Stripey the one that the Prime Minister would turn to first, as far as you know?
Quite often it was, because it tended to have the sort of juicy stuff in it.
In the number 10 private office, there would be regular battles over the red boxes between the civil servants and the political advisors.
There used to be the most unseemly competition on a Friday evening to get the last word onto the various papers going into the Prime Minister's weekend box under John Major or under Mrs. Thatcher. The political secretary, who would be a political appointee, and the head of the policy unit, who is a political appointee, would stay late and try and write a memo to put right on top of the pile of papers saying, really, you should do this, because they knew that's what would get read first, at least, before all the rest was read. But the Cabinet Secretary and Principal Private Secretary, the two civil servants, were much cannier and would always outweight them on a Friday evening to stick the very last word on top of their last word. So there's no one to arbitrate those kind of disputes, and that's what we thought we needed.
Alistair Campbell and Jonathan Powell were New Labour's top two special advisers, with the power to give orders to civil servants. The super spads spawned a new satire.
Malcolm, do you know?
Obviously he knows.
No, he does. There has been a massive, irretrievable data loss. The last 7 months' worth of new immigrant details have gone, apparently lost in the computer.
So, what is your great strategy for dealing with this? Come on, I mean, I'm fucking all ears. I'm fucking Andrew Marr here.
Tony Blair was determined greatly to strengthen the political side of the No. 10 private office. He brought in a record number of 30 special advisers. He wanted to ensure that ministers and their private offices across Whitehall danced to No. 10's tune.
Bloody No. 10. My special advisor on the communications side, Chris Norton, got a phone call from No. 10, very irate, because they'd heard I was doing a 8 interview on the Today programme. And there was all hell to play. What is he doing on there? Why is he doing it? What's the subject? It was actually the BBC journalist, Alan Johnston, who was held hostage for all that time, who was on the 8 interview on the BBC. But someone at No. 10 had heard that 8 would be talking to Alan Johnson. There was phone calls everywhere. So you certainly weren't allowed to kind of, without No. 10 knowing about it, be doing major radio or TV interviews.
When Johnson became Home Secretary 2 years ago, almost his first act was to see that his 4 spads would have proper accommodation next to his own room and private office.
Let me go and have a look where they are. Okay. I need to know my spads are comfortable.
They are, actually.
Johnson discovered that his spads would have the room next door.
I know, we've got a sofa and
look at that.
We can't escape us now. Biggest excitement. That's not too bad, actually, is it? We promise not to use your loo when you're not there.
Yeah, that's great.
Can you remember, you were concerned about the office for your special advisors, and you kept saying, where are my spads going to sit? Do you remember any of that?
Yeah, I do, because, you've been to places where the spads were kind of down the end of a very long corridor and a long way from you. And I'd been in places where they were very close to me, but in a little hovel. I mean, I wanted to make sure they were properly looked after. So, yeah, that was a question, a very important question, about how the mechanics. They were actually through another door in a very nice room, probably the best accommodation they've ever had. Far too posh for them, in my view, but they were through the door. So we had a kind of connecting doors. We were in touch with each other, and that was important.
What is the role of the spad?
Well, I guess it depends on the relationship with the minister, but for me it was always the eyes and ears of your minister. You are along with the private office, you are that barrier between the minister and an outside world that wants to, in many respects, try and make your life much more difficult than it is, or frustrate you in your objectives. So you're an advisor on policy, you're an advisor on communications, and you're an advisor, and this is where it changes from the civil service, you're an advisor on political strategy, and you can be party political, and you're allowed to be, and it's very important that you can do that, so that you send the right signals and messages out to the public in terms of what you're trying to achieve as a political party.
Part of it is ensuring that you don't just become a little enclave where the only people you talk to are your special advisors. You have to bring other people in. The sensible Secretary of State will have their principal private secretary in with the special advisors. They can't get involved in the political discussions, and they wouldn't, but they're there listening. And the principal private secretary then works much better with the special advisors, and as a result, so does the whole department. If special advisors act purely with the minister and lock out private office, lock out the rest of the civil service. If the Secretary of State colludes in that, you will have a disastrous department and a very unsuccessful Secretary of State.
The new Labour Transport Secretary, Stephen Byers, brought in his own personally appointed special advisor called Jo Moore. She alienated the private office by what they saw as her bullying style. The department had become hugely controversial. And in a notorious email on the day of the 9/11 attacks in Manhattan, Jo Moore wrote it would be a very good day to get out any bad news the ministry wanted to bury. The email was sent to Alan Evans, who'd been Principal Private Secretary and was now the Transport Ministry's Director of Communications.
I was surprised. It was a very unusual email to have sent, I seem to recall.
But what did you think at that stage when you get an email like that? This would be a good day to bury bad news.
I was shocked by it.
Mr. Byers, can you look up, please?
The political pressure on Stephen Byers had increased dramatically after Jo Moore's email was leaked from the ministry to the media.
Is that all right with you, sir?
No, get them out.
Yeah. Would you mind, please, just move out of here, please?
But Byers refused to sack Jo Moore, and she was kept hidden away until it was decided she should make a ritual public apology.
I'd like to sincerely apologise for the huge offence that I caused by sending the email. I can well understand the distress people will feel with what I wrote. I very much wish I hadn't written it. In fact, I find it difficult to believe that I did write it.
Byers now faced calls to resign as he stuck by Jo Moore, and there was open conflict within the ministry.
I think that the furore around that was actually a reflection of the fact that the relationship between the Special Advisor's Office and the civil service at the time was a poor one. And from what I know from the background to that, you know, there was perhaps some high-handed activity on the part of the special advisors there towards civil servants, and civil servants then used the opportunity to get their revenge in the best way possible, as a dish served cold.
Ministry officials leaked emails and stories about Jo Moore's behaviour. The leaks were so damaging that the top Mandarin at Transport, Sir Richard Mottram, used the strongest language to describe how bad the whole affair had been.
I've nothing to say.
Could you understand why Richard Mottram said, "We're fucked, you're fucked, we're all fucked"?
Well, Richard, in Mottram-esque language, was capturing the predicament the department was in at that time.
But I suppose that, in a way, that was seen as the epitome of how a special advisor thinks.
It was, but I would say that was a great exception to the way many special advisors work, and the fact that there are one or two examples where the relationship went wrong, or in that case spectacularly wrong. I don't think that takes away from the importance of the special advisor role.
Jo Moore was on her bike, forced to resign, as was her minister. Number 10 said there'd been civil war in the ministry. Though the number of special advisors had grown sharply under New Labour, they weren't a New Labour invention. There have been earlier spectacular examples of how SPADs could rupture relations, not just within a ministry, but between departments, right up to the top of government. One celebrated case involved the Treasury and Number 10. Professor Alan Walters, a right-wing market economist who'd been brought into Number 10 by Margaret Thatcher, was to be her special advisor on economics. But the Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, who'd begun as a Mrs. Thatcher favourite, came to resent Walters going public with views on the economy which differed sharply from his own.
The markets didn't know whether to believe what the Chancellor was saying, because was that really the government's policy, or was the government's policy a different policy, which they were getting from the Prime Minister's personal advisor? And that made it impossible, I felt, for me to do my job properly.
He objected to my having the Prime Minister's ear and pouring what he regarded as poison down it, what I regarded as the truth.
Lawson delivered an ultimatum to Mrs. Thatcher, saying she had to choose between himself and Walters.
They could have knocked me down with a feather. For Chancellor of the Exchequer, with all of the importance and reputation of that position, to come to me and say, unless you sack one of your most loyal advisors, I will resign. I couldn't believe it.
I hated resigning. It was certainly the last thing I wanted to do.
There's a man that lives next door in my neighborhood, in my neighborhood. He gets me down.
The fraught relations between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were made worse over a decade by anonymous attacks by each side's special advisors on the other. One briefing dramatically raised the stakes. A top-level No. 10 source with a good claim to know the mind of the Prime Minister described Gordon Brown as psychologically flawed. The Brownites, including Ed Balls and the spin doctor Charlie Whelan, reacted angrily.
Gordon Brown was very upset, and rightly so, because that's not the sort of thing that you expect from No. 10. But so he was very upset.
Where do you think the psychologically flawed came from?
According to the people who've written about these things, it came from Alistair Campbell. That's certainly where we thought it came from.
Well, it's not true.
It's not true?
No, it's not true.
You didn't say that?
No.
Really?
No. Yeah, absolutely not true.
You did not say that?
No.
You surprised me.
Well, there you are. You get surprised by a lot of things, Michael.
While New Labour's top two attempted a public show of unity, the SPADs in their private offices escalated the war of smear and counter-smear. When Matthew Taylor, a new political strategy advisor, arrived at No. 10, he sought to negotiate a peace treaty between the warring private offices of the tribes.
One of my many examples of naivety going into No. 10 was thinking that I could overcome the Gordon Brown, Tony Blair conflict, that I was somebody who really liked Tony personally, absolutely understood what a brilliant politician he was, but actually had a bit more sympathy for Gordon and his kind of social democratic credentials. I was the person to bring peace to this. And I remember every week I used to go for a walk in the park for the first few months with Ed Miliband, who was working for Gordon, and we'd walk around the park and I would try and be as open and discursive with Ed as I possibly could about what No. 10 was doing. And I would say, I'm not sure Tony is right about this, I'm trying to persuade him on this one and that one and the other. And we'd get nearly to the end of the walk, coming out of St James's Park, and there'd be a pause, and I'd wait for Ed to share with me, what was happening in the Treasury and where Gordon's persuasions were and where his preferences lay, and there'd be nothing. Ed would just say thanks for that, and he would disappear back into the Treasury. So I did that for a few weeks, and then came to realise it was pretty futile.
The war reached new levels of resentment and vehemence as relations between 10 and 11 went into meltdown. Can you understand why it is that special advisors are seen as part of the black arts and the dirty tricks department and smearing people, including their own colleagues?
Well, I think, I mean, that did go on, and I know it went on under Labour when we were in government, not systematically, but there were individuals who were motivated to do that.
The macho style of some prominent New Labour spin doctors like Charlie Whelan and Alistair Campbell was taken to a new level by Damien McBride. His proposed sex smear emails against top Tories made the thick of it seem more documentary than satire.
Do not make this a disciplinary issue. You hear me, soldier? I found her. She was on the fucking news.
Guys, can we get a bit more zen about this, please?
It is not a fucking discussion.
Right, nobody argue.
I am going to go in there and I am going to take you. Fucking no, fuck off. Jesus Christ!
Oh,
you know what? You've hurt yourself.
I've got so much on as it is.
I did not hit you. I'm going to hit the fucking wall and put my fist back and hit you in the fucking face instead.
I think you've broken my nose.
No, that's just a scratch, mate.
How accurate a portrayal do you think the thick of it is?
Well, I think there is a few I can remember who actually would model themselves on the Malcolm Tucker character, who actually see that as the way you do things. But that wouldn't be me. My goal was to have good relationships with the private office, because they're that line of defence for your minister against the wider civil service and the media and the world.
The first ever televised leaders' debates dominated last year's general election. Facing Gordon Brown were two former SPADs, David Cameron and Nick Clegg. Journalists watched the debate in the media centre that became known as Spin Alley.
Three men
each of whom wants to be our next Prime Minister.
Every promise you hear from each of us this evening depends on one thing: a strong economy. And this...
The new Labour spadocracy followed the debate in a private room.
Right now, and we can have secure jobs, we can have standards of living rising.
As the debate ended, Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson, Labour's campaign manager, sought to spin the journalists against Cameron.
It's precisely that sort of arrogance, that sense of entitlement that Mr. Cameron exudes.
George Osborne, Cameron's fellow ex-spad, was also spinning.
You've got to talk to George.
Osborne was briefing Ben Brogan, political editor of the Conservative Daily Telegraph.
Ben, tell George what to say. Go on, no, George, don't be put off your stride. Please, go on.
But back in his Whitehall ministry, on the eve of the general election, Peter Mandelson, the prototype political advisor, who'd become Gordon Brown's highest-ranking minister, prepared to thank the civil servants who ran his private office.
I've got some very, very good news. Win or lose, I could just stay. Obviously, if we win, it will be business as usual. I just, take decisions, sign warrants, dispense money like a Bourbon king. If we don't win, I still stay, but I help whoever comes in. And I'm not able to go around the whole department thanking everyone individually, but I can thank you because you have been so wonderful for me, and you've just supported me and just given me the time of my life.
The election saw the triumph of the Spads, who now held the two highest offices in the land. And another Spad graduate from private office was the new Chancellor. And 4 out of 5 of the candidates for the job of Leader of the Opposition to Osborne, Clegg and Cameron were also Spads.
Ed Miliband received 19.934%.
Ed Miliband had beaten his older brother. Ed had worked in Gordon Brown's private office, while David had worked for Blair. Like Cameron, the brothers had read PPE at Oxford, as had fellow Spad Ed Balls, who became Shadow Chancellor.
Ed Miliband. Speaker, I do say to him, there is increasing concern about the government's competence. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister think it's just a problem with the Foreign Secretary, or is it a wider problem in his government?
Well, first of all, he raises the issue of the Foreign Secretary. Let me tell you, I think we have an excellent Foreign Secretary. And when it comes to it, there's only one person I can remember round here knifing a Foreign Secretary, and I think I'm looking at him.
Yeah. Over the past 50 years, the arrival of the special advisers has dramatically altered the balance of power in Whitehall. The new professional political class that cut its teeth in the private offices and was famously characterised as the people who live in the dark, has grown to take over the reins of power. In constitutional theory, the head of government was first among equals, but these days the Prime Minister of Britain is first among Spads.
Stay with us here on BBC4 as Storyville's brand new season of Kidult Films continues next. We meet the boys who fought for Castro in Cuban Punch-Up.